The Last Man on Earth shouldn't exist, not the character. The movie itself. It was filmed in a country that didn't speak English, with a star who hated the script. Based on a novel the author tried to bury, the studio ran out of money, the director got fired, and one scene, they used real corpses because props cost too much. These are 20 weird facts about The Last Man on Earth. And the bonus? The author wrote the script under a fake name because he was so ashamed of what they'd done to his masterpiece. Lock your doors. This nightmare has a history. Number 1. Richard Matheson didn't just write I Am Legend. He lived inside it. The novel poured out of him in 1954. A post-apocalyptic fever dream about loneliness, survival, and the end of everything. It became a cult classic almost immediately, and Hollywood came calling. But when they asked Matheson to adapt his own book into a screenplay, he said yes with one condition. Don't change the ending, don't soften it, don't make it safe. The studios nodded, shook hands, and then did exactly what he feared. They rewrote entire scenes, added romance where there was none, stripped out the philosophical weight, and turned his meditation on humanity into a monster movie. Matheson watched the script get butchered in development meetings, watched producers argue over budgets instead of ideas, and finally, he'd had enough. He demanded his name be removed from the credits, not as a tantrum, as a divorce. The final screenplay lists the writer as Logan Swanson, a pseudonym Matheson used to distance himself from the disaster. It wasn't pride, it was survival. Because if the world was going to end on screen, at least his name wouldn't be attached to the wreckage. He wrote the movie, but he refused to own it. Number 2. Vincent Price was the last person anyone expected to play Robert Neville. By 1964, Price was known for gothic horror, camp classics, and a voice that could make a grocery list sound ominous. But Matheson's novel required something different. Neville wasn't a villain or a mad scientist. He was a man unraveling in silence, the sole survivor of a plague that turned the rest of humanity into vampires. He needed to be vulnerable, broken, desperate. The studio wanted a bigger name, someone with box office muscle. They approached Charlton Heston first, then Burt Lancaster. Both passed. The budget was too low, the script too strange, the ending too bleak. So the producers turned to Price, and he shocked everyone by saying yes immediately. Not because he needed the work, because he saw something in Neville that he'd never been allowed to play before. Grief. Not theatrics, not menace, just raw, suffocating loneliness. Price prepared for the role by isolating himself for days, avoiding friends, sitting alone in his house to understand what it felt like to have no one left. He didn't want to act broken. He wanted to feel it. And when cameras rolled, that's exactly what came through. Quiet, haunted, human. Number 3. The Last Man on Earth wasn't filmed in Hollywood. It wasn't even filmed in America. The entire production was shot in Rome, Italy, on a shoestring budget that made everyone nervous. Why Italy? Money. Italian studios offered tax incentives, cheaper labor, and locations that could double for a deserted American suburb without the cost of building sets. But there was a problem. Almost no one on the Italian crew spoke English. The director, Ubaldo Ragona, worked through a translator. Vincent Price had to pantomime instructions to lighting crews. Script changes were written on scraps of paper and passed around set like secret notes. It was chaos dressed as collaboration. Scenes were blocked out with hand gestures. Dialogue was rehearsed phonetically by actors who had no idea what the words meant. And when something went wrong, which was constantly, there was no quick fix. Just confusion, frustration, and the hope that someone, anyone, understood what the shot was supposed to be. But in a strange way, the language barrier helped. The film's cold, disconnected atmosphere, the sense that Neville exists in a world that no longer makes sense. It came partly from a set where communication had broken down completely. Art imitating life, or life imitating apocalypse. Number 4. Vincent Price wasn't the only person directing the movie. Officially, Ubaldo Ragona was in charge, an Italian filmmaker with a background in neo-realism and a vision that leaned heavily on atmosphere over action. But halfway through production, tensions exploded. Ragona clashed with the producers over pacing, over tone, over money. He wanted slow, creeping dread. They wanted faster cuts and more vampire attacks. The arguments grew louder, the delays piled up, and finally, the producers made a call. They brought in Sidney Salkow, an American director with a reputation for finishing projects on time and under budget. No artistry, just efficiency. Salkow arrived on set, watched a few takes, and immediately started changing things. He reshot scenes Ragona had already completed, tightened the editing, added more action beats. Ragona was furious but powerless. His name stayed on the film as co-director, but the final cut was a Frankenstein's monster stitched together from two very different visions. Ragona wanted poetry. Salkow wanted product. And what emerged was something caught in between. A film that feels uneven, disjointed, but strangely hypnotic because of it. Two directors, two styles. One apocalypse barely held together. Number 5. The film's most iconic images, the streets filled with wandering vampire figures, pale and lifeless, weren't created with a big effects budget or a crew of makeup artists. They were created with desperation and a classified ad. The production couldn't afford professional extras, so they put out a call in local Roman newspapers asking for anyone willing to show up, stand around, and look dead. Hundreds responded: students, retirees, drifters, people who just wanted to be in a movie. Most had never acted before. Some didn't even know what the film was about. The crew handed them pale makeup, tattered clothes, and told them to shuffle slowly and stare blankly. No choreography, no rehearsal, just raw amateur energy. And it worked, because these weren't trained performers hitting their marks. They were real people standing in the heat for hours, exhausted, confused, moving with the kind of awkward, ungraceful stumble that made them feel genuinely unsettling. The vampires in The Last Man on Earth don't move like movie monsters. They move like people who've forgotten how to be human. And that's because most of them had no idea what they were supposed to be doing in the first place. Number 6. There's a scene early in the film where Robert Neville drags corpses out of his house and burns them in a pit. It's brutal, unglamorous, and disturbingly real. And there's a reason for that. Some of the bodies weren't props. The production was so broke, so stretched beyond its means, that when they needed corpses for the burning pit scene, they couldn't afford to build realistic dummies or hire enough extras to lie still for hours under the Italian sun. So, they improvised. The crew made a deal with a local medical school and borrowed actual cadavers that had been donated for scientific research. Not for the close-ups, those were still mannequins and crew members. But for the wide shots of the pit, the piles of bodies being tossed into the flames, some of those were real. The cast wasn't told. The crew barely talked about it. It was one of those unspoken agreements that happened on low-budget horror sets in the 60s. A moral gray area no one wanted to examine too closely. Today, that would shut down a production instantly, but back then, it was just another way to save money. And the result is a scene that feels genuinely disturbing, because somewhere underneath the fiction, there's a thread of something real. Number 7. Vincent Price was a professional. He showed up on time, knew his lines, hit his marks. But there was one thing he couldn't stand: the script's dialogue. Matheson's novel was filled with internal monologue, philosophy, existential dread. The film tried to translate that into voiceover narration, and Price hated every word of it. He thought it was overwritten, melodramatic, too much telling and not enough showing. He fought with the directors, begged them to cut lines, offered to play scenes in silence. Sometimes they listened, most times they didn't. So, Price developed a strategy. He'd deliver the narration as written, flat, and emotionless, almost robotic, hoping it would sound so bad they'd cut it in editing. It didn't work. The narration stayed in, but Price's cold, detached delivery accidentally became one of the film's most effective elements. It made Neville sound exhausted, numb, like a man who'd repeated the same thoughts so many times they'd lost all meaning. He was trying to sabotage the dialogue. Instead, he made it haunting. Sometimes the best performances come from trying to ruin them. Number 8. The film's ending was supposed to be devastating. In Matheson's novel, Neville realizes he's become the monster, the last remnant of the old world hunted by the new one. It's a gut-punch revelation that flips the entire story. The movie keeps that ending, sort of, but it rushes through it, strips it of context, delivers the final twist in a few hurried lines of dialogue that most audiences missed entirely. Why? Time and money. The production was running over schedule, the budget had dried up, and the Italian crew was already moving on to their next project. They had one day to shoot the climax. One day to film Neville's capture, his trial, his execution, and his final understanding of what he's become. There was no time for setup, no time for emotional beats, no room for the philosophical weight Matheson had built the entire story around. So they shot it fast, cut it together faster, and hoped it would make sense. It didn't. Not to most viewers, but buried underneath the rushed pacing and clumsy edits, the soul of Matheson's ending is still there. Faint, damaged, barely breathing. Now, just like Neville himself. Number 9. The movie bombed. Not a little. Completely. When The Last Man on Earth was released in 1964, it barely made back its microscopic budget. Critics dismissed it as cheap, slow, and confusing. Audiences didn't show up. Drive-ins played it as a second feature, paired with whatever else they couldn't sell. It vanished from theaters within weeks and seemed destined to disappear entirely. Just another forgotten B-movie lost in the graveyard of 1960s exploitation cinema. But then, something strange happened. It didn't die. Late-night TV stations started airing it. College kids discovered it. Horror fans passed around bootleg VHS tapes. And slowly, quietly, a reputation began to build. Not as a masterpiece, but as something stranger. A deeply flawed film that had accidentally captured something raw and unsettling about isolation, about what it means to be the last of your kind. George Romero saw it before making Night of the Living Dead, and later admitted it shaped his vision of zombies as relentless, mindless hordes. John Carpenter watched it and felt its influence when crafting the siege sequences in Assault on Precinct 13. The film failed in its time, but it haunted everyone who saw it, and decades later, that haunting turned into legacy. Number 10. Halfway through the shoot, the money ran out. Not low, gone. The Italian producers had miscalculated the budget, underestimated costs, and suddenly there was no cash left to pay the crew, rent equipment, or finish filming. Production halted. The cast and crew stood around in the Roman heat, waiting for someone to figure out what came next. Vincent Price, ever the professional, didn't complain. He just sat in his trailer, smoking cigarettes, reading scripts for other projects, preparing to walk away. But then, something unexpected. The American co-producers scrambled, called in favors, took out personal loans, and somehow scraped together just enough money to finish. Not comfortably, barely. They cut scenes, reduced shooting days, fired non-essential crew members, and pushed forward on fumes. Some actors worked for free, promised back-end deals that never materialized. Some crew members were paid in wine and promises. It was a disaster held together with desperation. And yet, they finished. Because in the world of low-budget horror, running out of money isn't the end. It's just another obstacle. And The Last Man on Earth survived it, just like Neville survived the plague. Broke, battered, barely alive, but still standing. Number 11. The film's most chilling sequence happens in complete silence. Robert Neville boards up his windows, checks his defenses, and waits for nightfall while the infected gather outside. No music, no dialogue. Just the sound of hammering, breathing, and footsteps. It's suffocating, relentless, and it almost didn't happen. The original cut included a dramatic orchestral score throughout these scenes. Swelling strings and ominous brass designed to tell the audience when to feel scared. Vincent Price watched an early screening and walked out. He found the director in the hallway and said, "The music is killing it. Cut it, all of it." The directors resisted. Silent scenes were risky in 1964. Audiences expected soundtracks to guide their emotions, to fill empty spaces. But Price insisted. He argued that the horror wasn't in what might happen. It was in the waiting, the routine, the soul-crushing repetition of survival. Finally, they tested it both ways, with music and without. The silent version terrified test audiences more, so they stripped the score from those scenes, leaving only ambient sound and Price's shallow breathing. It was a gamble that paid off because the silence doesn't feel like absence. It feels like dread. Modern horror filmmakers still study those sequences, The way tension builds without a single note of music. Just a man alone, doing what he's done 1,000 times before, knowing he'll have to do it 1,000 times more. Number 12. They filmed the church scene on a Sunday. Not by choice, by necessity. The production needed a real Roman Catholic church for a flashback sequence where Neville remembers the world before the plague. They found a beautiful historic chapel, negotiated with the priest, got permission to film after morning services ended. But when the crew arrived with lights, cameras, and equipment, the priest changed his mind. He'd read the script, he saw the vampire elements, the religious imagery twisted into horror, and he wanted no part of it. He told them to leave. The producers panicked. They'd already scheduled the scene. The actors were in costume, the permits were filed. So they made an offer. More money, much more. Enough that the priest reluctantly agreed, but with strict conditions. No fake blood on church property, no dialogue that mocked faith, and they had to be gone by sunset. The crew raced against the clock, setting up shots in minutes instead of hours, running takes without rehearsal. Vincent Price delivered his lines in 1 or 2 takes because there was no time for more, and the priest stood in the backs, watching, making sure they kept their word. The final scene feels rushed, slightly off, but that urgency accidentally works. It captures the frantic last days before civilization collapsed, when people gathered in churches hoping for salvation that never came. Number 13. The mirrors weren't special effects. They were just mirrors. In vampire lore, the undead cast no reflection, a visual shorthand for soullessness that's been used in horror for over a century. But the last man on Earth had no budget for optical tricks or post-production magic. So when they needed to show the infected vampires recoiling from their own reflections, they had to get creative. The solution was brutally simple. They covered mirrors with a thin layer of petroleum jelly, just enough to blur and distort reflections without making them disappear entirely. Then they shot the scenes in low light, with actors positioned at angles where their reflections were barely visible. Ghostly, almost abstract. It wasn't technically accurate to the lore, but it was cheaper and somehow more unsettling. The vampires could see themselves, but what they saw was corrupted, warped, wrong. During filming, several actors complained the mirrors were too dirty to see anything. The crew just nodded and kept shooting, because in a film about humanity losing itself, maybe the horror isn't that you cast no reflection. Maybe it's that you do, and you don't recognize what's staring back. The technique was born from budget constraints, but it created one of the film's most genuinely disturbing visual motifs. Number 14. Vincent Price walked off set. Only once, but it was spectacular. The scene required him to stake one of the infected through the heart, a woman who'd once been his neighbor. The script called for blood, lots of it, spurting from the chest wound as Price drove the wooden stake home. But when they tested the blood pump, it malfunctioned. Instead of a controlled spray, it exploded, drenching Price head to toe in sticky corn syrup dyed red. His shirt, his face, his hair, everything coated in fake blood that wouldn't wash out. Price stood there, dripping, silent. Then he removed his microphone, handed it to a stunned crew member, and walked off set without a word. He didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't make a scene. He just left. Production shut down for the rest of the day. The next morning, Price returned like nothing happened, professional, prepared, ready to work. But the blood pump had been fixed, tested 6 times, and a crew member now stood by with towels and a hose. No one ever mentioned the walkout. They didn't have to. Price had made his point. He was willing to suffer for the film, willing to endure long hours, bad dialogue, and budget chaos. But he had limits, and a malfunctioning blood pump had found them. Number 15. The dog wasn't acting. In one of the film's most emotional scenes, Neville discovers a living dog, the first sign of life he's encountered in years. He chases it through abandoned streets, calling out, desperate for companionship. When he finally catches it, the dog trembles in his arms, terrified and exhausted. Vincent Price's performance in that moment is heartbreaking, tender, raw, and the dog's fear was completely real. The animal actor, borrowed from a local trainer, had never worked on a film set before. The lights, the cameras, the crew, all of it terrified the poor creature. Every time they tried to shoot, the dog would panic, yelping and struggling to escape. They tried for hours, running, take after take, but the dog wouldn't calm down. Finally, the director made a choice. Use it, don't fight the fear, embrace it. So they kept rolling, and Price improvised, holding the shaking animal, whispering to it, trying to soothe it. What you see on screen isn't acting. It's a genuinely scared dog and an actor trying to comfort it. And somehow that raw, unscripted moment became one of the most emotionally devastating scenes in the film. Because Neville isn't just finding a dog, he's finding hope, and hope in this world is terrified. Number 16, the film was banned. Not everywhere, but in enough places to matter. British censors gave it an X rating, restricting it to adults only. In Ireland, it was rejected outright, deemed too disturbing for public exhibition. Several Catholic organizations condemned it for blasphemy, for using religious imagery in a horror context. But the controversy that really hurt came from an unexpected source. Medical professionals. Doctors and public health officials objected to the film's depiction of plague victims as violent, mindless monsters. They argued it reinforced dangerous stigmas about disease, about contagion, about the sick being less than human. In 1964, the world was still processing memories of polio epidemics, tuberculosis sanatoriums, quarantine hospitals. The idea of plague victims as threatening, as something to be destroyed rather than cured, it touched a nerve. Some cities refused to screen it in theaters near hospitals. Others demanded disclaimers be added to promotional materials. The studio mostly ignored the complaints, but the damage was done. Potential audiences stayed away, worried the film was exploitative, irresponsible, cruel. Decades later, those same concerns would resurface with every zombie film, every pandemic thriller. But The Last Man on Earth was first. The first to ask what happens when the infected become the enemy. And the first to learn that question makes people deeply uncomfortable. Number 17. Richard Matheson never watched it. Not in a theater, not on television, not even when it became a cult classic decades later. Friends told him it had found an audience, that filmmakers cited it as an influence, that his novel had spawned an entire subgenre. He didn't care. To him, The Last Man on Earth represented everything wrong with Hollywood's treatment of writers. They'd taken his carefully constructed philosophical novel and turned it into a cheap monster movie. They'd stripped out the nuance, the intelligence, the soul, and they'd done it while using his words, his structure, his ideas. When people asked why he used the pseudonym Logan Swanson, he'd say it was because the film wasn't his. Not really. It wore his story like a costume, but underneath, it was something else entirely. Years later, when Hollywood tried again with The Omega Man in 1971, Matheson was brought in for consultation. He walked away after one meeting. Then came I Am Legend in 2007, and once again, he kept his distance. 3 adaptations of his novel, 3 films he refused to acknowledge. Because to Matheson, they'd never understood what the story was actually about. It wasn't about survival or action or monsters. It was about loneliness, about becoming the thing you fear, about the end of meaning. And no matter how many times they tried, Hollywood never got it right. Not in his eyes. Number 18. The prop department built Robert Neville's house defenses using real materials. Wooden boards, actual nails, functioning locks and chains. Nothing fake, nothing temporary. They constructed it like a real fortification because they needed it to look lived in, used, weathered by months of desperate reinforcement. But after filming wrapped, no one thought to dismantle it carefully. The crew just ripped it all down in an afternoon, tearing off boards, yanking out nails, destroying what they'd spent weeks building. One crew member kept a piece as a souvenir, a wooden plank covered in fake blood and scratch marks. He took it home, mounted it on his wall like a trophy. Years later, his daughter asked what it was. He told her it was from the end of the world. She thought he was joking. He wasn't. Because that's what low-budget filmmaking looked like in the 60s. You built real things, used them for a few weeks, then destroyed them and moved on. No archive, no preservation, no museum collection. The sets from The Last Man on Earth are gone. The props are scattered or discarded. Even the original film negative was lost for years, only rediscovered by accident in a warehouse in the 1980s. The movie about the last man standing almost didn't survive itself. Number 19. Vincent Price was paid $25,000 for the entire film. In 1964, that was decent money for a low-budget horror picture, but it was nothing compared to what major stars were earning. Paul Newman was pulling in $200,000 per picture. Charlton Heston commanded $500,000. Price could have held out for more, could have walked away when he saw the budget, the script problems, the chaos. But he didn't, because Price understood something most actors didn't. Genre films, horror films, the weird little movies no one expected to succeed. Those were the ones that lasted. The prestigious dramas won Oscars and were forgotten. But horror lived forever in late-night reruns, in fan conventions, in the cultural underground. Price bet on immortality over paychecks. And he was right. Decades later, his performance in The Last Man on Earth would be studied, analyzed, celebrated as one of his finest, despite the film's flaws. He made pennies compared to his contemporaries, but he bought himself a legacy. And in the end, that proved far more valuable than any studio contract. Number 20. The Last Man on Earth ended up inspiring the entire zombie genre, but it did it by accident. George Romero watched it in 1964, a young filmmaker with no budget and no connections, sitting in a dark theater while Vincent Price fought off vampire hordes. And something clicked. Not the vampires themselves, but the siege mentality. The idea of being trapped while mindless creatures surrounded you. The slow building dread of knowing they'd never stop coming. When Romero made Night of the Living Dead 4 years later, he wasn't copying The Last Man on Earth. He was responding to it, refining it, stripping away the vampire mythology and replacing it with something more primal. Zombies. Flesh eaters with no intelligence, no personality, just hunger. The DNA is unmistakable. The boarded windows, the supply runs, the paranoia, the realization that other survivors might be more dangerous than the monsters, it all traces back to Matheson's novel and this flawed, forgotten adaptation. But here's the strange part. Matheson never intended to inspire zombie films. He wrote about vampires, about folklore, about the last remnant of humanity facing supernatural evil. The zombie connection was an accident, a misreading that became a revolution. Sometimes the most important legacies are the ones you never meant to leave behind. Bonus fact: Vincent Price kept the wooden stakes. After filming, wrapped, exhausted, and ready to leave Rome behind, he asked the prop master if he could take home a few souvenirs, not the fancy items, not costumes or set pieces, just the wooden stakes. The crude hand-sharpened dowel rods that Robert Neville used to kill the infected, to survive one more night in a dead world. The production didn't hesitate. They were worthless. Scrap wood destined for a trash pile. Price took 3 of them, carefully wrapped them in newspaper, and carried them on the flight back to Los Angeles like fragile artifacts. He mounted them on his study wall, right above his desk where he read scripts and planned his next roles. And when guests visited, curious about the strange display, they'd ask what those wooden spikes were for. Price would lean back, that famous voice dropping to a whisper, and say they were insurance. Against what, they'd press. Against boredom, he'd reply with a grin. But there was truth buried in the joke. Price understood something most actors never figured out. His career didn't live in prestige pictures or award ceremonies. It lived in the shadows, in the weird, low-budget corners of cinema where other actors feared to go. Those stakes weren't just props from a troubled shoot. They were trophies. Evidence that he'd survived another production that should have killed everyone involved. Reminders that sometimes the worst films, the most chaotic shoots, the projects everyone expects to fail, those are the ones that refuse to die, just like The Last Man on Earth.